So it's a good question. We have checked locally, we have no reports of any missing children that match these identifications. We are checking statewide as well.
Not everything announces itself with chaos. Sometimes the most horrifying stories begin in complete silence. Sitting in plain sight, blending into the ordinary. Nothing looked out of place. No warning signs, no urgency. Just another day, another routine. Until a small, almost forgettable moment shifted everything. The kind of moment most people would ignore, but this time, it couldn't be ignored. And what followed wasn't just disturbing, it was the kind of discovery that forces an entire community to confront something unthinkable. Because buried beneath what seemed normal was a reality so dark, it would leave even investigators struggling to process what they were seeing. The call didn't come in as a dramatic emergency. No frantic screaming, no immediate chaos. Just a man, clearly shaken, trying to explain something he didn't fully understand himself. His voice carried that uneasy tension, the kind that tells you something is very wrong, even before the details come out. He had been walking his dog, like he always did, through a quiet area near a school on Cleveland's east side. It was routine, familiar, safe, but for days his dog had been acting strangely. Not aggressive, not scared, just fixated. Every time they passed a certain spot in the field, the dog would stop, sniff longer than usual, refused to move on. At first, it didn't seem like much. Dogs do that. They pick up scents humans can't even begin to process. But this wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was persistence. And after nearly a week of the same behavior, that persistence started to feel unsettling. So that day, he decided to check. What he found wasn't immediately obvious. A suitcase, partially buried, barely visible under the dirt. Not something you expect to see in a park, especially near a school. It looked out of place, but not necessarily alarming until he got closer. He described it as heavy, oddly positioned, like someone had tried to hide it but didn't quite finish the job. And then came the moment that changed everything. He pulled it out, unzipped it just enough to look inside, and instantly, he knew. He didn't stay. He didn't investigate further. He backed away and called police, his voice unsteady as he tried to describe what he had just seen. There was no confusion anymore, no doubt. Whatever was inside that suitcase, it wasn't supposed to be there. When officers arrived, even they approached with caution. The area was quiet, almost eerily still. The suitcase sat there, partially exposed, like it had been waiting to be discovered. One officer called for backup, choosing not to open it alone. There's a certain understanding in moments like this. When something feels off, you don't rush it. You wait, you prepare. But nothing really prepares you for what they found. As more officers arrived, they carefully examined the suitcase. There were no immediate signs of blood on the outside, no obvious indication of what was inside. But the smell, that was different. Subtle but unmistakable. Then they opened it. Inside was the body of a young girl, folded tightly, motionless, hidden in a way that made it painfully clear this wasn't accidental. This wasn't something that just happened. This was deliberate. And as disturbing as that moment was, it wasn't the end of it. Because just a short distance away, about 25 yards, officers made another discovery, a second suitcase. Same condition, same attempt to conceal it, same horrifying reality inside, another young girl. At that point, the situation escalated instantly. This wasn't just a tragic discovery, it was now a full-scale homicide investigation involving 2 children. The entire area was locked down. Detectives were called in. Forensic teams began processing the scene, trying to piece together what had happened and how long those suitcases had been there. The ages of the victims made it even harder to process. Just 10 and 8 years old, 2 children, left in a field, near a place meant for safety and learning. And what made it even more unsettling was the timeline. The man who found the suitcase believed it had been there for about a week. His dog had been reacting to it for days, which meant these girls had likely been there, unnoticed, while people walked by, while children went to school, while life continued as if nothing was wrong. That realization alone was enough to shake the community. But investigators had an even bigger problem. No missing persons reports matched the victims. Think about that for a second. 2 children, and no one had officially reported them missing. That immediately raised questions. How does that happen? How do 2 young girls disappear without triggering alarms? Without schools noticing? Without neighbors questioning anything? It suggested something deeper, something more complicated. As investigators worked to identify the victims, they relied on DNA analysis. Eventually, they confirmed the girls were half-sisters. Their names would later be revealed. But at this stage, they were simply 2 unidentified children at the center of a growing mystery. Meanwhile, detectives began tracing the location. Where the suitcases were found wasn't random. It was close to residential areas, close enough that whoever left them there likely knew the surroundings. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It required effort, transporting the bodies, attempting to bury them, choosing a location that wouldn't immediately attract attention. That kind of behavior points to familiarity, and that's when the investigation started narrowing in. Authorities didn't have to look far. Within a relatively short time, they identified a person of interest. Someone connected directly to the victims, someone who lived nearby, someone who, on the surface, didn't fit the profile of what people expect in cases like this. A mother, Aaliyah Henderson. At 28 years old, she had no significant violent criminal history, no record that would immediately raise red flags. To neighbors, there was nothing outwardly alarming, no obvious signs of what was allegedly happening behind closed doors. But as investigators dug deeper, the pieces began to align in a way that was both shocking and deeply disturbing. The proximity of her home to where the suitcases were found, the connection to the victims, and the growing evidence that suggested this wasn't something recent. Because according to early findings, the timeline of the children's deaths might stretch back months, not days. Which means for a significant period of time, something had gone terribly wrong, and no one outside that home seemed to know. And as that realization started to sink in, law enforcement prepared to take the next step. They weren't just going to knock on the door, they were going in. By the time investigators shifted their focus toward Aaliyah Henderson, the case had already taken a deeply unsettling turn. But what they were about to uncover would make it even harder to process. This wasn't just about what had been found in that field anymore. It was about what may have been happening long before those suitcases were ever discovered. The decision to move in wasn't taken lightly. When police believe they're dealing with a case involving multiple child victims, especially under circumstances this severe, they don't take chances. That's why it wasn't a simple knock and talk. It was a coordinated SWAT operation. Bodycam footage captures the moment officers approached the home. Commands are shouted clearly, sharply. Hands up, come down now. There's urgency in their voices, but also control. Every movement is calculated. Every second matters. Because at that point, they don't know exactly what they're walking into. And then, she appears. Wrapped in a blanket, Aaliyah Henderson steps out, following instructions, surrounded by officers. There's no visible panic, no resistance, no outburst. If anything, what stands out the most is the lack of emotion. She avoids eye contact, keeping her face partially hidden, moving exactly as directed. It's a moment that feels almost disconnected from the gravity of the situation. But then something else cuts through that silence. A child's voice, crying from inside the house. That detail alone shifts everything. Because now, this isn't just about what happened in the past, it's about what's still happening in the present. Officers quickly move to secure the home, making sure no one else is in immediate danger. The child inside was found alive, physically unharmed, but the emotional weight of that moment, hearing that cry in the background while their mother is being taken into custody, it's something that lingers. For the officers, for anyone watching later, it's a reminder that this situation is far more complex than just the evidence already discovered. As Henderson is escorted to the police cruiser, the scene remains eerily calm. No dramatic confrontation, no visible breakdown. She stays quiet, composed, almost detached. Even as she's placed into the vehicle, there's no outward reaction that matches the severity of what she's being accused of. And that contrast is what makes it so unsettling. Inside the home, investigators begin processing the scene. Details start to emerge, some unexpected, some difficult to interpret. The living space appears lived in, not abandoned. There are everyday items, signs of normal life. But then there are things that stand out. A ring camera set up inside. What appears to be a dance pole in the living room. It's not what you expect in a case like this, and yet it adds another layer of complexity to understanding the environment those children may have been living in. Nothing about this feels straightforward. Henderson is transported to the station for booking, and again, the pattern continues. She remains calm, cooperative. No visible signs of distress as officers take her fingerprints, her photograph, process her into the system. She's wearing what appear to be pajamas, another detail that reinforces just how suddenly this situation escalated from a private home to a full criminal investigation. Then comes her first court appearance. Standing before a judge, facing 2 counts of aggravated murder at that point, the courtroom atmosphere is heavy. These are early proceedings, but the seriousness of the case is already clear. The prosecutor outlines the allegations briefly but directly. 2 young children, 8 and 10 years old, found deceased, their bodies concealed in suitcases and buried in a field. Even in a courtroom where difficult cases are routine, this one stands out. The state immediately pushes for a high bond, $2 million. Not because of her past record, but because of the nature of the accusations, the severity, the risk. When charges involve the deaths of children, especially under circumstances suggesting prolonged harm, the system responds differently. Henderson's background, at least on paper, doesn't match what many might expect. No prior violent convictions, no significant criminal history. Her defense points this out, emphasizing that she has ties to the community, that she's lived in the area her entire life, that she's been actively looking for work. They argue for a more reasonable bond, leaning on the idea that her record doesn't indicate she's a flight risk or a danger in the traditional sense. But this case isn't being evaluated in a vacuum. The judge acknowledges her lack of history, but also emphasizes something far more important: the nature of the allegations. And in cases like this, that factor outweighs almost everything else. Bond is set at $2 million. No hesitation. It's a decision rooted in caution, in public safety, and in the recognition that the accusations themselves are among the most serious the system can handle. Henderson responds with little more than a nod, no visible reaction, no emotional display, just a quiet acknowledgement before she's escorted back into custody. But while that initial hearing focused on just 2 charges, the investigation behind the scenes was expanding rapidly, because as prosecutors began presenting evidence to a grand jury, the scope of the case widened significantly. This wasn't just about 2 counts of murder anymore. It was becoming something much bigger. More charges were added, many more. And with each new count, the picture of what may have happened inside that home became increasingly disturbing. Aggravated murder, kidnapping, felonious assault, child endangerment, tampering with evidence, abuse of a corpse. A total of 26 charges, each one representing a different aspect of the case, a different allegation, a different layer of what investigators believe occurred over time. And perhaps the most chilling detail wasn't just the number of charges, it was the timeline attached to them. Because according to the indictment, the alleged offenses may date back months, possibly as far back as November of the previous year, which changes everything. This wasn't a single moment. It suggests something prolonged, something ongoing. And that raises the most difficult question of all. What exactly were those children experiencing during that time? Because if that timeline is accurate, it means this situation existed for months without being detected. No reports, no interventions, no interruptions, just silence. And as that timeline began to surface, investigators and the public were left trying to understand how something like this could go unnoticed for so long. As the indictment details began to surface, the case shifted from shocking to almost incomprehensible. 26 separate charges weren't just numbers on paper. They represented a pattern, a timeline, a series of alleged actions that painted a picture far more disturbing than the initial discovery in that field. 6 counts of aggravated murder, 4 counts of murder, kidnapping, felonious assault, child endangerment, tampering with evidence, abuse of a corpse. Each charge added weight, but it was the dates attached to them that truly changed how this case was being understood. Prosecutors pointed to a window stretching back to mid-November, months before the suitcases were ever found, which forces a reality that's difficult to sit with. If those dates are accurate, then whatever happened to those 2 girls didn't happen suddenly. It didn't begin in that park. It didn't end there either. That field was just where everything was finally discovered. The real story may have been unfolding behind closed doors for a long time, and that realization triggered a wave of questions that investigators are still trying to answer. How did 2 children, 8 and 10 years old, disappear from normal life without anyone raising alarms? No school reports, no missing persons cases that matched, no immediate red flags from the outside. It suggests isolation, a situation where contact with the outside world was limited, controlled, or possibly cut off entirely. Because in most circumstances, children that age are visible. Teachers notice absences, neighbors notice changes. Systems are designed to catch those gaps. But here, something slipped through. Or maybe it was never fully seen to begin with. As authorities worked to reconstruct the timeline, another layer of the case began to emerge, one involving custody and family dynamics. According to reports, the fathers of the 2 girls had made repeated attempts to be part of their daughters' lives. One of them, the father of 8-year-old Ma Chapman, spoke publicly, but chose to remain anonymous. His words were direct, frustrated, heavy with regret. He claimed he had been trying for years, 6 years, to gain custody, that he had reached out multiple times, that he had even contacted Child Protective Services, hoping someone would intervene. But those efforts, according to him, never resulted in change. the children remained where they were. And now, looking back, that history takes on a different weight, because it introduces the possibility that concerns may have existed long before this case ever came to light. Whether those concerns were documented, dismissed, or simply didn't meet the threshold for action, those are questions that may become central as this case moves forward. The father's words reflect something else too, a sense of helplessness. I feel useless. I couldn't save my daughter. That kind of statement doesn't just come from grief. It comes from the belief that there were moments, opportunities, where things might have been different. And that's something that often surfaces in cases like this. The space between what was known and what was acted on. Meanwhile, investigators are still working to determine one of the most critical pieces of this case, the cause of death. As of now, that detail hasn't been publicly confirmed. The condition in which the bodies were found made the process more complex. Decomposition, environmental exposure, and the passage of time all make forensic analysis more difficult. But that answer matters, because it helps establish not just how the children died, but potentially how long they may have suffered before that point. And with the timeline already suggesting months, that question carries even more weight. At the scene where the suitcases were discovered, something else has started to take shape. A memorial. Flowers, stuffed animals, notes, a quiet acknowledgement from the community that something tragic happened there. A way for people to process what they're struggling to understand. Because when cases involve children, especially under circumstances this severe, the impact extends far beyond the immediate investigation. It affects everyone who hears about it. Parents, neighbors, strangers. There's a shared reaction, a mix of disbelief, anger, and grief. And yet, even with all the attention this case has received, there are still gaps. For example, why that location? A park near a school isn't exactly remote. It's not hidden. It carries risk. People pass through regularly. Which raises the question, was it chosen out of familiarity? Convenience? Or was there another reason entirely? And then there's the issue of timing. If the suitcases had been there for about a week, as the witness suggested, why that moment? Why not sooner? Why not later? Those decisions, where, when, how, are rarely random. They tend to reflect the mindset and circumstances of the person involved, which is why investigators continue to analyze every detail. Back at the center of it all is Aaliyah Henderson. Now facing a full 26-count indictment, her legal situation has escalated significantly. What began as 2 charges has expanded into a case that could carry severe, long-term consequences if proven in court. Her next court appearance is expected to address those expanded charges formally, an arraignment where each count will be presented, and she will enter a plea. And from that point forward, the case will move into a more structured legal phase. Evidence will be examined, arguments will be made, timelines will be challenged. Because as strong as the allegations may seem, the burden of proof still applies. Prosecutors will need to establish not just that a crime occurred, but that it occurred in the way they claim, over the period they've outlined. And the defense will do everything possible to counter that narrative. But outside the courtroom, the questions don't wait for legal conclusions. They're already there. How did this go unnoticed? Could anything have been done differently? Were there missed warning signs? And perhaps the most difficult question of all, what were those final months like for those 2 girls? Because beyond the charges, beyond the investigation, beyond the legal process, that's the part that lingers. Not just what happened, but how long it may have been happening, without anyone able to stop it. As this case moves closer to its next court date, what remains isn't just a legal battle. It's a story that continues to leave people unsettled on a deeper level. Because even with arrests made, charges filed, and timelines beginning to take shape, there are still pieces that don't fully make sense. A mother with no violent history, 2 children who seemingly vanished from everyday life without immediate alarms, and a timeline that suggests this didn't happen overnight, but over months. That combination is what makes this case so difficult to process. It challenges assumptions. It forces people to question how something like this could exist without being interrupted. Whether it's gaps in the system, isolation within a household, or warning signs that were too subtle or too late to act on, those are the kinds of discussions that often follow cases like this. But inside the courtroom, those broader questions narrow into something much more specific. Evidence, intent, timeline. Prosecutors will work to establish a clear sequence of events: what happened, when it happened, and how it happened. They'll rely on forensic analysis, digital records, witness statements, and anything else that can connect those months between November and March. The defense, on the other hand, will look for inconsistencies, gaps, anything that creates reasonable doubt. Because in a case this serious, every detail matters. Every assumption is tested, and until that process plays out, there's one important reality that remains. These are still allegations, serious ones, disturbing ones, but ones that still have to be proven in court. At the same time, outside that legal framework, the emotional impact doesn't wait for a verdict. The memorial at the park continues to grow. People stop by, leave flowers, stand in silence. It's a quiet acknowledgement of two young lives lost in a way that no one expected, and no one can easily explain. And maybe that's the part that stays with people the longest. Not just what was found, but how long it may have gone unseen. Because cases like this don't just end when the investigation wraps up or when a verdict is reached. They leave behind questions about awareness, about intervention, about the moments where something might have been different. And those questions don't have easy answers. But they do matter, because understanding how something like this happens is often the first step toward preventing it from happening again. As this story continues to unfold, more details will come out, more clarity will emerge. But for now, what we have is a case that forces people to look closer, at the systems in place, at the signs that are sometimes missed, and at the reality that not everything dangerous is obvious on the surface. If you've been following this case, I want to hear your perspective. What stands out to you the most about this timeline? Do you think there were warning signs that could have been caught earlier? Or is this one of those situations where everything stayed hidden until it was too late? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Your insight matters more than you think. And if you want more breakdowns like this, make sure to like the video, share it with someone who follows true crime, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.